chair.
Hi, Agnes.
Okay.
Hi, John.
Hello.
Sorry, Monday. Good evening.
I just mute myself. Yeah.
Hi, Tammy.
You're on mute, Tammy.
I think that should do it.
You are, yeah.
Mm.
How is
How is-
Lydia feeling?
And Lydia, there
Hi.
she is.
Right there.
I think it was food poisoning.
Oh, Lydia, no, really.
Yeah, it
From
was very
home.
dramatic, but then it ended quickly.
Well, thank God, thank God.
Yeah.
From like
thanks for your
home.
nice note.
Do you know
Oh.
what you ate or where you are?
It makes no sense.
It-
I ate a
Wow.
half a sandwich from my dinner the night before. I mean, it was refrigerated, it was properly. That's the only thing I think I ate differently than John.
Yeah, otherwise we ate exactly the same thing, so it's kind of a mystery.
Wow. Oh, that's awful. Well, thank God you're better, Lydia.
Yeah.
Thank God that's an awful thing.
Very unpleasant.
Mm,
It is.
absolutely.
It is. Hello, Fran. I see you. So I think let me see who are we missing tonight. Nancy. We'll just give Nancy a second before she gets here. See if she didn't say she wasn't coming, so we'll give her a second. All right, I see you. My cat is actually up and running around.
That's a good thing for Francis.
Oh, I know, Agnes. I just don't know what to make of him. I think that it's, he is eating better than he's ever eaten in his life.
Wow.
His mobility is just really limited, and I think it's his arthritis. I mean, the ulceration looks like it's healing under here, but I think it's his arthritis. And not sure what to do with the pill. This time he went to the vet, he had a little AFib, and he's never had AFib, but the injection says it can cause AFib. So not quite sure what we're going to do with this arthritis. We're going to pray a lot, I think. But for some reason, he's up and around tonight. So maybe we'll open with prayer, and if Nancy signs in, and Nancy didn't say she wasn't coming, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Hopefully she'll make it. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for bringing us to this night and for the opportunity to share your word and your wisdom. We pray, O Lord, that you bless us with your presence so that we may be guided by your direction. We ask, O Lord, that you open our hearts and our ears and our minds to hear what you need us to say and to be able to take that word out into the world. All this we ask in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Amen. So here we are on chapter 20. Questions, comments about this?
Well, speaking for myself only, you're gonna have to explain this one. Like, I'm not sure what we are supposed to take from this, I find odd episode with
Yeah.
King Abimelech, which
Yeah,
seems to be
Abimelech, yeah.
sort of a replay of the thing with
Yeah.
Pharaoh back in chapter 12.
Mhm.
So I infer from that Sarah must have been quite stunning looking because they're always taking her away and he has to pretend she's not married to him.
Yeah, so yeah, this is a quite strange story, right? And there are a few explanations. Anybody else? Because there's a different explanation for why her taking away in this. And that is not to take away for the fact that Sarah might have been very stunning. She's listed as 93 at this time, but it would be very much like 53, according to how people are aged out in the Bible, right? So she's middle aged, and I guess she could be really stunning at middle aged. But there is a different reason in this chapter why she is taken. And this time, because notice the text doesn't mention her beauty this time. The text says nothing about her being beautiful. And so there is actually another explanation that we will get to, John. Remind me, and it's important, so I hope I remember, but remind me about that. Anybody else about this chapter? And yes, it is like a doublet. It is like a doublet of another story that we had read before with the situation with Pharaoh. With some similarities, right? as well as some differences. Okay, Nancy's having trouble getting on. Um, hold on. Don't know why. Just give me 1 second. I'm not sure how to help her. Hey, Nancy, I'm not sure how to help. We're all signed on. There you are. Okay, here she
Finally.
is. There you are. I'm sorry, what was the problem?
It just would not let me on. It kept saying
Oh.
I had to type in the code, and I was like, no, you just
Oh.
type and go. Anyway, so
Sorry.
I've been sitting here for seriously like 5-6 minutes trying to get it to work.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry.
hi.
You're very determined. Thank you, Nancy. We were just talking about our first impressions of Genesis 20, right? And John was saying, this one has a lot of explaining to do.
Another one.
Yeah.
At least for me. At least
They
for
all
me.
do, right? Well, it seems strange, right? That there's like two stories that are very similar. I mean, there's this wonderful quote by one commentator that says, this Genesis 20 seems about as necessary as a fifth leg on a cow, right? And
Makes sense to me.
and that makes sense, right? But believe it or not, there is a reason behind this, right? And some scholars will say, well, they were two different traditions, because when we were still in the PowerPoint, we talked about how the regions in the Palestinian area each had different traditions that they brought to the table, right? Some of those regions, the patriarch was Abraham, and this is just a scholarly opinion. I don't totally go with this. I do believe that they are actually descendants. There's some scholars who say no. There were, Abraham was the patriarch in this area, Jacob was in this area, Isaac was in this area. And then when the redactions came along, this redactor kind of wove this into one story. I believe that each region had its patriarch, but I don't believe that it wasn't descended. I think that's super important in God's story, and I don't believe that part. However, there are some scholars who will say, well, this is because the Egyptian story came from this region, and now this story, one was the Yahwehist, one was the Elohist, that came from different periods, and it was just included in this narrative. I don't know if I quite buy that, right? Because I tend to think everything in the Bible tells us something, even when it's very hard to understand what it's trying to say. I think that everything is written with a point. And again, papyrus was too expensive to waste. They weren't going to just put stories in there just for the sake of stories. It has to tell us something. And hopefully by the time we get done tonight, we will have figured out something that this tells us. So anything else anybody wants to say? So,
I'm good.
so
Yeah.
the similarities are very clear between this and Genesis 12, right? The story of Pharaoh taking Sarah, correct? Right. We have Abram kind of wandering into different territory, not directed to do so by God's command, right? He goes into this territory of Gerar as an alien. And remember, an alien means somebody who is a foreigner, but like kind of resides there, but not permanently. It's like a temporary, like he's temporarily staying there. Also, again, Abimelech takes Sarah, the same as Pharaoh. She's taken into his harem. But there are some differences, right? And at the end, Abram, for some reason, ends up vastly richer than he went into this. But there are some differences. So, what differences might have you seen in those two stories, aside from the location?
I have to go back to 12 to remember.
Sure, that's okay.
Well, one that you just mentioned, I guess apparently for some kind of atonement or something, the king grants all these riches to
Mhm,
Abraham,
mhm.
which that's another part I don't exactly get. The king didn't do anything wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm with him. When God says, I'm going to kill you, he says, wait a minute, I didn't know she was married. She told me it
Yeah.
was his sister.
Yeah, so that's really important, John, right? I mean, that actually tells us something about God. Remember, this is called Genesis. It means beginning, but it's really a story of origins. That tells us something, right? And it is really the revelation of God. What would that tell us? So first thing I'm going to say this is that and I'm jumping ahead of the story, but when he awards Abram, it's really not for Abraham per se. It's more for Sarah's integrity so that she wouldn't be looked at as a shamed woman when she moves out of this position, right? That there was just something wrong with her that the king threw her out of his harem, right? It's really for Sarah's honor. He gives it to Abram. I think is it 50 shekels of silver? Which is like
More,
25 pounds of silver. A Babylonian.
1,000 pieces of silver.
Okay, it says 1,000. It's like 25 pounds. It equates to
1,000 shekels.
1,000 shekels. Okay. So to put this into perspective of what that would be like, is that a Babylonian laborer would get a half a shekel wage, right? This is 1,000. This is like 25 pounds. It's a lot of money, but it is really more for Sarah's integrity. He gives it to Abraham because Abraham's her husband, right? He can't personally give it to Sarah, but it's really to say she's not a shamed woman. And if people would,
Why would she have been a shamed woman?
well, because it would have looked like she was thrown out of the harem, right? That something was wrong with her, that the king dismissed her from the harem.
Looks like it's like a soap opera. I mean,
It is a
and then-
soap opera.
but she was his Sarah was his what?
Abraham.
Stepsister?
Abraham's
Abraham,
half sister.
Half sister.
Yeah.
Half
So
sister.
his half sister. They share the same father. Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is the first we're told this, right? We're not told this in the Egyptian narrative with
Mhm.
Pharaoh. Now, there is a belief in the ancient Near East that you strengthen and empower a woman if you marry your half sister. That if you marry a sister, it's to help strengthen and empower them. It wasn't unusual. This was common practice. It really incest only becomes against the law right after the Mosaic law. It's really not at this time. People are intermarrying. And in small tribal societies, right, especially after the diaspora, it's very important because because the pool is slim pickings. And the pool is not genetically mutated at this point. So it's not like when we think of it today, right? A lot of tribal societies did that out of necessity. So it really wouldn't have been shocking that Sarah is his half sister.
Ew.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lydia.
Mhm. But
Yeah.
remember, right, but they all practiced it. So, I mean, it would have been like they wouldn't have thought anything of this. Right? And that's not just the Judaism, right? God's chosen, excuse me, covenant people. They're not Jews right now. But it was just how the world worked.
And they didn't notice any weird children being born.
They did not at that time, right? But then when you start talking about the time of Moses, right, then it does become against the law. It's outlawed in the Torah.
Kill him. Well,
But it is,
yeah, Lydia was asking a question. The reason in 20 as in 12 is the reason for the artifice, I'm just his sister, because otherwise they would have killed Abraham. I mean,
yeah,
why the subterfuge?
yeah, so remember he's an alien, right? Which means he doesn't have any connections to anybody in that territory. He doesn't have family. I mean, this is a tribal society. He goes in, a lone wolf. He doesn't have anybody that would have protected him. And so, he's fearful again for his life. The same thing as what happens with Pharaoh. He's fearful that he's going to be killed and there's nobody to defend him. Now, why does Abimelech take Sarah? It is believed in this story, like so unlike the story with Pharaoh, and that is a title, right? This is not this person's name. That's what they call Philistine kings. Um, in the story with Pharaoh, however, right, she's taken for her beauty. But in this story, most scholars will say she's taken as this as like a sort of political pawn. By this time, Abraham is quite wealthy and influential and powerful. And, harems really weren't about sex. They were about, building alliances, right? We see this in Solomon. With the Solomon has is, all of these concubines and all of these wives who aren't Jewish, right? They come from foreign lands because they're political alliance. And so Sarah being taken in this story is believed that no, it's not for her beauty, it's not mentioned. It would just be a really strong political alliance to have her in his harem, right?
And that would be the anger God would show that he did that towards the king.
So if you
I
so
showed the king what he did wrong. Wait a minute. Let me look at this.
yeah, you do look at it, Agnes, right? No,
She, mm.
how do you all feel about that, right? Is God angry at him?
At home.
The king, the Philistine king.
Yeah, and he tells him you're about to die because of the woman you have taken is a married woman.
Right.
Right.
Well, he tells
Well,
him that, but
And also at the very end, it says he had prevented any of the women from getting pregnant because of
Mhm.
Sarah.
Yes,
Mhm.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't know
Yeah.
what that has to do with. Yeah.
I didn't either, Agnes. I couldn't
Okay.
figure that one out either.
So do you remember in the story of Pharaoh, right, where there's some kind of illness that they're never really telling us what that illness is, right? And it's the same thing again, right? The women are infertile. And the idea of this story, right? God has closed the womb, right? Human hands, inspired by the Spirit. But what is also different in this story is what God calls Abram. Did you see that? Okay, so let me first go back. The Philistine king, and it might help us just to walk through this chronologically. The Philistine king is not condemned by God, right? God gets his innocence. And in fact, God is pretty much on his side. Now, why he says, what you have about dying is, let me find it, John. Right, is pretty much saying when you've taken a married woman, there's a good chance her husband's going to kill you, right? Because he's not in on this. But so I think maybe
But
we
he
should start.
But he gave her over.
He did. Well, he's fearful again, right? This is like a reoccurring sin on Abraham's part. And this is really one of the reasons it makes it to this text, right? Is that Abram and Sarah have already been down that road. And you would think they would have learned from what they did, right? Not to do it again, but they don't. They don't, right? It's reoccurring sin. But they're not going to be able to go into this promise if they haven't dealt with this. In other words, this kind of deception is still in their hearts, is still in the back of their minds. And God isn't going to allow them to go through with the promise, right? The seed that will become Isaac until they deal with this, until they deal with this problem. Because they're very apt to fall into this. And if they continue to fall into it, right, there would be a very good chance that Isaac would not be the promised seed through Abraham, right? There's no relationship here with Sarah and the king. But it is a threat to the promise. There could have been, but it's prevented. And so when Sarah has Isaac, there's no question of paternity. It shows God's grace, right? This seed is going to come through the grace of God, right? This is why why Ishmael cannot be the promised seed. Must come through God, not human effort. Okay. Hagar is human effort. Sarah hands Hagar over and Abram takes that opportunity and banks on Ishmael being the promised seed. And God is like, no, that is a seed from human flesh. This must be a seed from the grace of God. And we all know about reoccurring sin, right? We can find ourselves in these stories. we can do something at some point and then be like, I'll never do that again, and then we fall back into it, right? This is pointing to humanity's inclination to continue populating the same sin over and over again. Questions before we start at the beginning?
Oh my God. Just keep going.
You're right on moving, right?
Lydia's had it already.
We know you're not sick, Lydia. No excuses. Yeah. So, yeah, I know this is a strange thing. I know it's, but it tells us something about God in the end, and I promise we will get to that. So, so we start at the beginning in 20.1, right? We have Abram leaving, right? He's moving south. When we talk about Gerar, right? It's south. It's straight down the West Bank to the southern half of of Palestine. Moves through these different cities, right? And it's not at God's behest. God doesn't say to him, do this. We really don't know, right? The author doesn't tell us why Abram decides he's going to pull up the stakes and start moving again. Lots of theories. Was he like couldn't stand to be, stand on that hill and be reminded of what happened in Sodom? Is he disgusted at Lot's actions? It is whatever happened in Sodom, like if it's a natural force of nature, right? Is it dangerous to the flocks, right? Is it a volcano and it's dangerous for the flocks, so he has to move? We're really not told the reason he moves, but he does, right? And he moves again and he becomes an alien resident, which means that, doesn't really belong, but there to stay for at least more than a few weeks, right? Very common of pastoral nomads at that time. They would move on, especially when the competition for pasture got tough. So they would move on, and there would be sort of this dual living, right, for people who were already settled, and then these nomads who would come to settle with them for a bit of time and then move on, right? And this is what Abraham and Sarah are doing. And again, he says to the king, she is my sister. And again, he probably takes her as a political alliance. Right? Notice again, it does not say she's beautiful at this point. So we assume that it's to make an alliance with this really powerful nomad. But God does something, right? He comes to the king in a dream by night. Very common in ancient near A&E history. That's how gods usually communicate to mortals in a dream, right? Very Elohimist, right? If you remember from the PowerPoint, that's a characteristic of the author of the Elohist writings. And dreams are very important to them. And God appears in this dream, right? And he says, you're about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, right? Again, a warning that she's got a husband. And that husband might be very jealous and he might kill you, for she is a married woman. Now, this is a much different reaction, right? This is a much different reaction than Pharaoh has. He kind of stands up to God, doesn't he? Kind of puts God in a predicament. This is a pagan king, right? Not part of the covenant. He doesn't worship this God, but he certainly addresses this God as Lord, right? And he says to him, Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? In other words, we're not Sodom. Right? This nation is not, decrepit like Sodom. It's a contrast to Sodom. It is really a contrast to, this is a pagan nation. But he's pointing to the faithfulness of the nation, right? These people are innocent. And he rightfully points out to God, right, that hey, listen, this guy said she's my sister. And she said he's my brother. I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands. Right? It's a common Hebrew phrase to say, no guilt. My hands are clean of this. Hello, Frank. My hands are clean of this, right? He talks to God, right? And God is conversing with him. Not Abraham. And he is essentially, the king is essentially, claiming all of these things that God expected of Abraham, right? God expected Abraham to have clean hands. God expected Abraham to have integrity. But Abraham doesn't. It's on the other foot now, right? The shoe is on the other foot with this. What does this tell you? Does this tell you anything about God?
No, I'm lost.
Tell me where you're lost. Tell me where you're lost.
No,
Is
it's just
everybody feeling lost?
I'm just
Remember?
the only one admitting it. Um, no, it's just the story just gets deeper and deeper. In other words,
Mhm.
I feel like the lie is getting deeper.
It does here, right? Because he doesn't learn. Abraham doesn't learn.
Okay.
Yeah, he doesn't learn, right? And that is the point of this narrative, to show us the how reoccurring sin affects our lives, right? He's been very straight sometimes with God, and he's been very faithful, but there's always this backslide. But notice what God does in this backslide, right? And this is really important. Remember, Genesis is to teach us about the characteristics of God. It's our introduction to God. You always want to ask yourself, what does this tell me about God? Because these passages all say something about God. Any guesses?
Spoon feed us, please.
It's a funny thing because on the one hand, it seems
Mhm.
like he can read. Well, okay, so it's a just God.
Mm-hmm.
The king has pled his case, and God says, "You're right. You were innocent of this,
Mhm.
although he did abduct the woman from her husband. So, but anyway, he was innocent by his own eyes. But then there's this, to me, odd phrase where God says to him, "I know what you did. You did this in the integrity of your heart.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her."
Yeah.
So that seems a little, non-free will-ish. Like,
It
oh,
does,
by the
I
doesn't it,
way,
John?
agree.
you didn't touch her because I prevented it,
Mm-hmm.
which is a little different than saying, "Hey, I didn't know. Yeah, I thought she was
Mhm.
unmarried. Nobody told me. In fact, they told me the contrary." But then God says, "Well, okay, I'm going to punish you. No, I'm not going to punish you. But by the way, I kept you from
Mhm.
sinning."
Mhm.
Seems
Mhm.
to me that's incongruous to me.
Yeah, right. There is a bit of disconnect there. And as I will say, in all of this, right, spirit inspired human hands. And by that, I mean so many times in our lives, right, we can go through the motions of things and things happen. But when we look, and we might not think anything about it, right? But when we look back, we realize the points in our lives where God is present, right? And it would seem very much logical for people who were writing this to look back and say that was God's grace. That was God's grace in action. He didn't touch Sarah because God was present. Right? Have you ever had that moment in your life where you looked back and you said, "Hey, this didn't happen. That must have been a divine intervention." And I would say very much, this is what the authors are trying to tell us. Remember theology, that the authors were saying that God's grace is present because this is God's promise. God has promised a seed that is going to carry salvation to all nations. And so God's grace didn't allow the king to touch her inappropriately, because if he had, right, there would have been a huge question of paternity of Isaac. And so this is the reassurance, A, of God's grace when it comes to the seed, right? And B, there is no question that Isaac is Abraham's. Right? This chapter is all about the grace of God and the fact that God is talking to a pagan and saying to a pagan that you are essentially righteous, you did what was right. I know that you have a clean heart in this. Your hands are clean, your heart is clean in this. I understand that. That is showing us in this chapter, when we hear in the prophecies, the prophets are great for saying the God of all nations, right? This is showing that God, right, is giving grace to all those who honor him, right? He's not just saying, hey, listen, you're outside Abram's circle, too bad, so sad for you. God is blessing him with that grace. God gets it. Does that help any? Because otherwise it would be very much, even when Abraham is just messing up all around, it would be very easy to say, well, God just protects him because he was the called. He was the chosen one, right? That's not really the case in these stories. This is an early indication that God's grace extends to all people, all nations. And then he tells the king, right, to return her, right? And all those, and again, all those things about integrity and clean hands that God expected of Abraham's prize, they're not coming from Abraham, the chosen, right? They're coming for people outside of that promise. It's very much like the Magi. These Gentiles who go and seek the Messiah when they're very much outside the circle. I see this all the time in throughout the Bible, right? That when we want to get too haughty in saying, well, God is the God of chosen people. Okay, so that was the Jews and the Hebrew Bible. Hey, but now here we are, the Christians, right? It's not, God has an open mind and heart and is overly willing to extend God's grace to all people who come to him. And this shows, he doesn't say to the king, too bad for you. He's like, God is understanding. I know that this happened, right? I know that this happened, but we can make this right, right? Return her, return Sarah, right? There's the Hebrew word for this has a sense of urgency. Give her back now. Quickly, don't make haste to do this. Give her back, right? For he is a prophet and he will pray for you. That's a new concept, isn't it? And here I want to say also, and I just looked down at my notes, and I should say that also, right? When the king pleads his case, and saying, I have a clear conscience and clean hands, tells us two things about faith, right? It's spelled out in a negative term and it's spelled out in a positive term, right? The presence of inner integrity and then the absence of outward wrongdoing. Says something about our faith, right? What does faith mean? Go ahead, Nancy, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, say that again, please, about the inner and
Yeah, so when the king pleads his case to God, right? He says, let me find it, and then return. When he says, my hands are clean. I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, right? It's saying that in his faith can be both an inward expression, right? The faith is inside with a clean heart, but it also is an outward expression. Faith is also expressed outwardly as well as inwardly, right? And that's kind of on the lines of yesterday's sermon, right? Is that it's dual action. If we have integrity of heart, then our actions are going to reflect that, right? Tells us about faith. Faith isn't just being pure inside, because if you're really pure inside and you have a lot of integrity inside of you, it's just going to naturally flow in your actions. But God says this really interesting thing, right? He will pray for you. What says that to all of you? I mean, we know that prophets, their job is being God's messengers, but here we find out that a prophet's job is also an intercessor.
I was gonna say, is this the first time we have an intercessory
Mm.
relationship? I don't think we had people praying on behalf of others to God or being the intermediary
Mm-mm.
with God.
We have not, John, right? So yeah, this is the first intercession, right? And what does that say to us? What does it say that Abraham as a prophet, right, can pray for somebody, right, to make things right?
So he must be in special relation to God then.
Yeah, and it says that God, listens to these prayers, that we can make a difference through intercession prayer, intercessory prayer can make a difference. God isn't oblivious to those prayers. Because he certainly tells the king, give her back right away. And then, and he'll pray for you and you shall live. And again, here, I don't necessarily think that they're referring to life and death, right? I think the Hebrew idea here is that, well, all of the women at this point in the king's kingdom um, are infertile, right? They can't produce. They have closed wombs. And that is the death of a nation. When you can't have babies, the nation is on its last leg, right? It's hospice for the nation. Nation's on hospice because they can't have babies, right? And so when it's saying, know that you shall surely die, I don't believe that that is a reference to his life. You and all that are yours, right? The nation's not going to succeed. And here I want to say Gerar is more of an independent city state. So he is not like, this big king like Pharaoh would have been. It is a Philistine city state on the coast, right? In a town, a city state that would have been very prosperous, right? It's on the coast. Gerar actually served as like a resting place for people who were merchants, who were traders. It's a fairly industrious city, right? There's a lot of activity going on there, but it is not a big nation, right? It's an independent city state, and his role would have been more like a mayor than like, this big king. He is not a king. But, but even then, right, if you can't have babies, your nation is doomed. And so God says to him, go and let him pray for you. Questions, comments there? So the king does, right? And it's really funny because it says, so Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants, right? That is the same wording, if you remember, from our last chapter in Genesis, right? Abraham gets up early in the morning that Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be destroyed, right? And this is kind of like, he also gets up, right? Intentionally gets up so that he can call his servants and talk to them because, they're really afraid because they know that Abraham has this connection to God. They know that Abraham is a person, is a man of God. Even though Abraham doesn't necessarily show it here, but they are aware that there's something special in the relationship. And he calls Abraham to the carpet, right? And the fact, what have you done? Right? And the fact that he has to be redundant in this, like, what have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you brought such great guilt on me in my kingdom? You've done these things to me that ought not to be done. And then you notice, it's very much like Pharaoh's conversation with Abraham. Done, did, right? Puts all of this on Abraham's shoulders. And the fact that he has to badger Abraham a little bit shows that Abraham really doesn't have an answer at first. Right? He's got to ask a lot of questions. What have you done? How have I sinned against you? You've done these things, right? And Abraham said, what were you thinking that you did this thing, right? In 10, he reiterates that question. So in other words, he calls Abraham out in the carpet, and Abraham has absolutely nothing to say about what he's done. Nothing. And so he repeats it again. What were you thinking? There's no excuses for Abraham. There's nothing. And then finally, Abram gives this really weird answer, doesn't he? What is it in 11?
Well, I thought they would kill me because she's my wife.
Yeah.
But besides,
Oh,
I really
but be-
was telling the truth because she is also my sister. He's giving a
Yeah,
double-barreled answer.
it is. But what does, yeah, so, but what does he say in 11 though? He says something before that, before he talks about Sarah, right? That's a besides. Sarah is the besides.
Yeah, because I thought surely the fear of God is not here.
Yeah. Right, right. We call that situational ethics. Right? That's what psychology calls that. That the situation is dictating his behavior, right? Not his personal morals, not his values, but the situation is dictating what he's going to say, right? He's forced to decide between two evils and he makes that choice. It's all based on the context, right? He jumps the gun on the appearance. He sees this nation that is not part of the covenant. He looks and says, hey, no big deal, right? They're not part of my circle. They're not part of the blessing. They're not part of what God's about, right? And he gives this lame reasoning, right? God, I didn't think that God was in the house. I didn't think that God could be with you people.
That's pretty potent.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? No, Abraham's edgy. He's edgy.
Okay.
He's not like this lovable hero. What are you thinking, right? He goes to situational ethics. He's like, no, but I didn't think you people were God-fearers, right? And they'll kill me because my wife, because I didn't think God exists here. So you got absolutely no morals, right? He doesn't give them any credit that they could be moral people, right? I didn't think God was here. And then besides, she's my sister. Hey, I'm not lying, right? And she became my wife. And then in 13, woof, he says something really big, doesn't he?
13.
Yeah. And when God caused me to
He
want,
basically blames God.
he blames God for all of this, right? For putting him in this situation. So the Hebrew word that's used for wander, right, is used 50 times in the Hebrew Bible and never in a good way. Animals wander, they go astray, right? Drunken men stagger and wander. Sinful seduction makes us wander. False prophets' lies make us wander. Right. It's the path of a lying heart. And God made me do this. And there's 6 different words that you could use for wander, but Abraham does not. He uses this very negative connotation, right? It's his indirect way to blame God for all of his problems. God sent me on this dangerous journey, and it's all God's fault. I had to protect myself. Not learned anything, has he? And then, right, then the king restores Sarah. He does something that Pharaoh doesn't do, doesn't he?
I don't know what that is.
Anybody else?
Well, he addresses Sarah.
He does. Yeah, he does that. Yep. Right. He restores Sarah. My land is before you. Just Sarah, he says, look, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. I mean, and that brother might be a little bit sarcastic. And he kind of shoots that word back at her, right? I've given your brother. Hello, it's actually your husband. Um, right? It's your exoneration before all who are with you, you are completely vindicated. This sarcastic rebuke. People will no longer look down at Sarah as a compromised woman, will no longer question any shame of her being thrown out of the harem, right? He has compensated, he has validated her innocence. But he does something Pharaoh doesn't do here. Comes in 15.
Well, it gives them land or tells them you're free to not be an alien anymore, basically.
Yeah, he invites him to stay, right? Pharaoh doesn't do that. He invites him to stay. And this is a really, really staggering comment on people outside the blessing, right? He's doing all the right things. He's doing all the right things that Abraham is not. Abraham has been deceptive. He's blamed others. He's blamed God, right? And this pagan outside of the promise is really coming out vindicated in this, right? And then last but not least, right? Then Abraham prays to God, and God heals his wife and the female slaves. God opens their wombs, right, to the king's household. And which is a great lead-in, because Sarah's womb will also soon be opened. Questions, comments about this? What did you learn about?
It's just so incredible.
Well, it's
You
so
know,
much. Go
the
ahead, Nancy.
deceit. No, the deceit and
Yeah.
the masquerading.
Yeah. Is that identifiable to us as humans?
Of course.
Have we ever masqueraded before God? I have a feeling that lots of people masquerade before God. But these characters in the story are not developed in the way that we think of character development in 21st century stories, right? There's so much we don't know about these people. But biblical writers are really keen and very talented at telling us what we do need to know. Because the idea of all scripture, and particularly narrative, I think of John's gospel too, right? That's a purposeful writing to bring us into the picture, right? And think what we would do in similar circumstances. So first it reveals something about God, and then it reveals something about ourself and our relationship with God. Because if we really think about it, we can find, we might not pass people off as our half brother, as our sisters and brothers, right? We might not have these circumstances, but we certainly all know about reoccurring sin, right? We certainly all know about blaming God for something. We certainly all know about thinking in our own haughtiness that some people aren't worthy to be included in that promise, right? We make decisions about who belongs in God's kingdom and who doesn't. We do that all the time, right? I always go back to my Sunday school when I was a Sunday school student, and that family, it was an immigrant family who had come for Christmas Eve service. And right in the middle of the service, when it's dead quiet, you could hear from the choir box, what are those people doing in our church? And and that happens all the time, right? We tend to define, we tend to say we want to grow, but then we like to define what that growth should look like. It should look like us. It should speak like us. It should think like us, right? This chapter is really, really pertinent in telling us that God's grace belongs to everyone, right? God doesn't punish Abram here, right? It seems kind of unfair that Abraham keeps getting away with things, but it's just about God's grace. We think about it, we get away with things too. And thank God bestows that grace. mean, this has a lot to say about that. It's a lot to say. I mean, and especially coming off the heels and going into another story about Hagar. I've been working with somebody in who's one of our virtual viewers. And we've been talking a lot one-on-one about Hagar. That's huge. That's huge. And that it might roll off our backs, right? And we might not think about how enormous that is, that this slave woman from an enemy nation of Israel, right, is really honored and held up by God and uplifted. I mean, she's the first woman in the Bible that God speaks her name. These women characters are very strong. And so are, and this pagan character is very strong. Because I bet you can think of a lot of people that some people who don't profess faith, right? And yet act very much in line with God's will. People we would say, I don't belong in church, right? And think about humanists. They don't believe in God, but they've got this strong ethic that aligns with Christ's teachings. And this narrative shows that God recognizes that. God isn't afraid to bestow grace to even people who we consider outside of the kingdom. We were talking the other day at an ECS meeting, and we're talking about the origins of some of the churches in the area. And one of our co-chairs is from St. John on the Mountain. And we were talking about how St. John on the Mountain was the church for the elite. And then St. Bernard's was like the servant church. They were not allowed to worship together.
Oh.
I mean, they're in affiliation now, but, because we define who should have, the right access to God and who shouldn't. So we have historically Black churches also. That's how they came about. And if I'm not mistaken, and I might be misquoting this, I believe St. Augustine in Red Bank was like the slave church fraternity in Red Bank, I believe, and I could be totally wrong. Somehow Christ Shrewsbury is mixed up in that too. But yeah, I mean, because we define what we think should belong in God's kingdom, and this shows that God doesn't make those definitions. And in fact, sometimes the people that we think don't belong and shouldn't be blessed by God's grace turn out to be the really holiest of the two of us.
Yeah.
That's what this says. I mean, it said it a little bit in the story with Pharaoh, but this goes even more overboard, right? Because this guy doesn't say, hey, like Pharaoh says, take your wife and get out of here. This guy continues to provide hospitality to someone who has done him over. And God recognizes that. And God graces him. The wombs are open, right? So the nation will continue. Right. And what follows immediately after that? Right. 21. Right. The Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. She finally conceives like 15 years after this promise. Yeah. Yeah. And we have no doubt that this is a child of grace, not that of the Philistine king. Questions, comments about this? Does this help put this story back into perspective?
Yes, it's a very roundabout way of making the writer's point, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big, long, contorted story, right? And it probably came from an oral tradition. So, there was a lot of time to spend around the campfire telling these stories. But notice, and I hope you're noticing
Yeah.
this in Genesis, right? I'm hoping that you're noticing in these narratives how everything reveals a little more about God. That's really what I want you to see. Like when you read these stories, I want you to really say to yourself, what does this tell me about God? What's the purpose of this book of origins?
That I'm having trouble with.
How's that, Nancy?
Well, it's just the stories are
Mhm.
they're almost unbelievable. In other words, I'm sitting back listening to this going, really? You know, like that was the way of life. It's hard for me sitting here today to accept
Mm.
that as ordinary.
Mhm.
And as
That
Westerners,
there's
right? Because there are parts of the
yes.
world
Oh,
that are still
definitely.
doing this, that are still living this, right? Because we're 21st century Westerners. And a lot of this seems really offensive.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
But in no way condoned by God, right? Bible always gives us a couple choices and asks us to reflect on what choice, we're going to take.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, like, and I know this is really, really hard for us being 21st century Westerners, but we do need to read these through the cultural lens they were taught in, right? We also need to read it through the lens of theology. So when I've been talking to our one new student that has gone back to the very first class, we talk often about that, is that if we look at this as any other genre but theology, like there's a huge problem, right? Theology is meant to tell us about God. And if these texts, as we really believe happened, were um were redacted and put together to make a whole narrative by the by redactors who maybe were like in exile or after exile, it makes perfect sense, right? As a theology. It might not make sense as a history, and it might not make sense as a science because they weren't written for that, right? History to ancient Israel is much different than our history today. Our history is like, chronologically and events and milestones. That's not what history for ancient Judaism would have been. History for ancient Judaism would have been explaining their relationship with God and their chosenness, which goes to hell when the exile happens, right? Because how could God's people be in this mess? The temple is destroyed, our land is destroyed, all the promise, the seed is destroyed, all of this is destroyed. And when you have, for 50 to 70 years they're in exile, right? And they have all this time to think about it. And the priestly case, right before they return from exile, begins to look at that. Like, why did this go wrong? And they have this great inspiration by the Spirit that tells their story in this manner, right? Through texts that they knew, traditions that they knew, stories that they knew. And believe me, this is not a case. Some people will say, well, that seems really fake. It's not, right? And why do we know that? Because could we sit down and do this? Right? It is definitely, when you read the Bible cover to cover, there is no way that human hands could have done this. I mean, they did, but not from the human mind. It had to be divinely inspired. We couldn't have gotten it right like this. And so it doesn't take away from the realism of these stories, right? As ancient Jews saw these as real historical stories, it doesn't take away from them that they were woven together. It adds to their divinity because it makes sense, right?
Mhm.
Because it makes sense. Because it reveals so much of God that we would never know. And so again, I always caution you, when you read these texts, they're theology. They're explaining something about God. They are not history. They are not, science. They're a theology. And good theology should tell you something about God, God's nature. Who is God? And tonight we learned what? We learned that this is the God of all nations, that grace isn't limited to the people who think grace should be limited to.
Hmm.
The church gets like that. As the church, meaning the universal church, we're very haughty. We don't, that's why anti-Semitism runs rampant. Especially in the years we read that gospel from John, my God, like that's my favorite gospel, but that is a very anti-Semitic piece of work. So much so that, like I said yesterday, there was this Roman Catholic nun, and I forget, no, I think it was in the 70s, that actually, petitioned the Pope to make a statement on this because it's so anti-Semitic. And the Pope did. If you ever want to see Sister Rosa's story, there's a great short video on her. But yeah, anti-Semitism, it's rampant in the New Testament, in the Gospels.
When I was still worshiping
Mm-hmm.
at the Catholic Church,
Mm-hmm.
there is a disclaimer, at least there was in those years.
Mm-hmm.
There was basically a disclaimer in that
Okay.
passion. It was very
Mhm.
interesting because it said, and it was there for the lay people to read too. It said, homilists are reminded that this must be placed in its proper historic context, that when there are references to the Jews, that should be understood to mean the leaders of the Jews. There's a whole long
Yes. That's
involved.
because of Sister Rose, John.
It was there. I mean, when you said it, I was thinking of that
Mhm.
when you said it yesterday. I was thinking, yeah, there was a disclaimer at the bottom of that part of the
Mhm.
passion. And it was pretty interesting. It stuck with me all these years later.
Good for you. Yeah, and that was the work of Sister Rose, and I think it was done during Vatican II. And really, she petitioned the Pope to have that done because it is, right? And we use it for anti-Semitic reasons today. It is. It's like really bone chilling. Like, listen during the Passion Play on Palm Sunday. Not sure which one we're reading this year, probably Matthew. But it is. It's like the Jews this and the Jews that, and the Jew. Jesus was a Jew. Hello.
I mean, it said not that long ago, I think, in Europe, people would leave the Good Friday service and go attack a
Yeah.
synagogue, would go attack
Yeah.
a Jewish community.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
not getting the point of the gospel, but
Right, John. Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. We anti-Semitism, you can find anything in the Bible that you want to weaponize and use against people, but we have and we continue to do so today. That's why it's really important for everyone to know their scripture, right? So that you can be able to defend the faith in the right and proper way, and that you won't get sucked down the wrong rabbit hole. Because people who are skilled at weaponizing scripture are really convincing. Right? Those false prophets are out there.
Yeah.
And yeah, so, there's lots of false prophets out there. So when you hear them saying, God is only the God of white Christianity, the story says otherwise. And questions, comments about this. Does that help you put this a little bit more in perspective? Help put your reading more in perspective?
I think so.
Good, good. Yeah, I want you to put your reading into perspective with this. I mean, the next one is when Ishmael is actually sent away, and Hagar, that will be the end of Hagar and Ishmael in the story. And then the final chapter really of the Abraham story, the climax, right, will be the binding of Isaac, which we'll get to in 2 weeks. And then it's kind of then we'll probably have to see where I want to go from there. Maybe 24. No, maybe we'll talk about 23. That's kind of important. But yeah, that is important. But Abraham's narrative is coming to an end. That we will climax that in 22. In the binding of Isaac, who, according to the Quran, was actually Ishmael. That Muslims have a different point of view. Right, because in 22 it says, take your son, your only son, although it says Isaac, but they have a different philosophy of that. Questions, comments. I just have one thing that I want to announce after and see how you're feeling about this. And you don't have to say yes or no for this. But So do we have anything else on chapter 20? We're good to go with that?
Good to go.
Let's go. So I've been thinking, and I don't know if we'll actually get to this, but I really, really am thinking about this. As many of you know, you probably all know, that I actually had the two best Hebrew teachers in the world. My first Hebrew teacher when I was in seminary was Alison Grusecki, who was this great, Alison Acker Grusecki, who was this great animal rights person and just empowered me and supported me, and I love her to pieces. She had no idea that her job was up for grabs. She found it on a want ad from General. General never clued her in that she was about to lose her job. And ultimately, the person who she did her studies, her graduate studies with, they were very good friends, actually ended up with this job and kind of broke that friendship up. But it was a plus for me, right? Because I was petrified because I'm like, oh my God, I was Alison's mentee, right? The person that was so connected with Allison. I thought, oh, because Julie had to do my thesis when Allison left. Julie turned out to be amazing, amazing. And I was just so blessed with these two women. And Julie in 2022 wrote a book called Eve Isn't Evil. Allison is a very academic writer, really just writes for scholarly papers and other academics. But Julie is a Methodist minister, and she's really, really down to earth. And so I was talking to somebody today about the possibility of doing just like, I don't know, not a Bible study, but just a really informal study with this book. Because all of you are in the middle of Genesis and questioning all of these horrible things. And Julie has some really amazing insights in that book. You can go on Google Books and get a really fairly big preview of that book. So when you get some time, I would invite you to take a look at that. It's called Eve Isn't Evil. And take a look at the first few chapters. And if you would like us to do a study on that, we can certainly do that. I think
What is her last name?
She is Julie Faith Parker. And you could never. Oh yeah, Lydia. I mean, we started the other classmate who's virtual now. We started looking at that book today. I hadn't had a chance to read it when it came out in 2022. But you couldn't get the preview on Google Books. Now it's old enough. You can go on Google Books and read a great deal of it. But it is really, and her insight, I read the first few paragraphs of a few of the chapters, and her insight is so earthy and so real. And she writes about the prophets, she writes about Job, she writes about Eve, she writes about all of these biblical, the Song of Songs, all these really hard to and misunderstood people and writings. So take a look at it. And if you're interested, let's do something together with it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it. And she's so great. She's really just an amazing woman. And helps.
Okay.
She also wrote a book on children in the Bible, which is pretty cool too.
I'll have to look
So-
that one up too.
Yeah, that one, there is no preview on Google Books for that, but yeah, she's amazing. So take a look at it and see what you think, and we can come back and say, yeah, do we want to study? We might be able to get some of the other guys back that we lost that we've lost in Genesis.
They burned out on Genesis.
It did.
Yeah.
But we might be able to sneak some of Genesis in with Julie's book about Eve.
Don't tell them.
Don't tell them. But take a look at it and see what you think, and we'll see you guys on Sunday.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the night. Uh-huh.
Thank you. You
Stay
too.
warm.
Good night, all.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.